The Association of the United States Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's Thought Leaders webinar series, a webinar series featuring military leaders and contemporary military authors. Kicking off today's webinar is AUSA's Vice President of Education, Lieutenant General Guy Swan.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Thought Leaders webinar series. We want to thank you for joining us today for the webinar, and we're glad you've joined us, and we appreciate your support as partners in the defense of our great nation. Before we start, I'd like to give a special thank you to our sponsor today, Defense One. In just 8 years since its founding, Defense One has become a valuable contributor to the global debate about national security. With a combination of breaking news, insightful analysis, and constant look at the future, Defense One has a sharp focus on today and tomorrow, and we appreciate that Defense One covers many of our AUSA events. So thank you to Defense One. Joining us today to discuss their new book are, to my left, Colonel Tom Vossler, United States Army retired, and Dr. Jeff McCausland on the far end here. They're going to talk about their new book, Battle Tested, Gettysburg, Lessons Learned for 21st Century Leaders. It's appropriate, we were talking that this week on Friday, the 1st of July, will be 158 years since the iconic battle at Gettysburg. So very timely for us to meet here today. For those of you joining us online, please take advantage of having Dr. McCausland and Colonel Vossler here to ask questions. You can use the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen to submit questions. After the discussion, we will take as many questions as time allows. You'll also find the full bios for our panelists at the handout tab. Just a brief word about our guests before we get into the discussion. Dr. Jeff McCausland is a retired U.S. Army colonel and former Dean of Academics at the U.S. Army War College. He's a visiting professor of national security at Dickinson College and a national security consultant for CBS News. He commanded a battalion during the Gulf War and worked on the National Security Council staff at the White House. Colonel Tom Vossler served in the United States Army from 1968 through 1998. He commanded an infantry platoon in Vietnam and a mechanized battalion task force in Germany prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet regime. His military education includes graduation from the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College and the U.S. Army War College. Colonel Vossler taught military history, strategy, and leadership at the Army War College and is a former director of the U.S. Army Military History Institute at Carlisle Barracks. Just a few words before we start. Like many of you, I've read many books about leadership, but I have to say Jeff and Tom, our guests today, have written a truly remarkable book that will help both military and civilian leaders understand some of the universal leadership lessons put to the test in one of the most iconic battles in modern military history. A real strength of the book is how they make these lessons come alive and make them accessible, understandable, and applicable to a broad audience. They have skillfully done this by examining the critical decisions made by commanders at all levels of responsibility during the Battle of Gettysburg, from the strategic level down to the tactical level, in the crucible of combat. And then they relate these decisions to those being made today by leaders in the corporate boardroom right down to the manufacturing floor in the crucible of today's marketplace. Having been in some leadership positions myself throughout my own career, I find that I can never stop learning about leadership, one of the most human interactions that we know. In my view, and I'll put a plug in for the book, Battle Tested should be on any leader's professional reading list, whether you're an experienced leader or an aspiring leader. So with that, I'd like to ask Colonel McCausland, Dr. McCausland, why don't you start us off, Jeff, with a little bit about the book and what you guys were trying to do with the book.
Well, thank you very much, sir. And first of all, I know on behalf of Tom and I, We want to thank you and the Association of the United States Army for allowing us to participate in the AUSA Thought Leader webinar. It's really an honor, truly an honor for both of us to be here today. Quickly, what I'm going to do is make a couple introductory remarks and pass it to Tom to kind of put a broad leadership background and why that's important. And then I'll return at the end to talk about some anecdotes from the battle that we think illustrate some of the principles that you mentioned in that very, very stunning introduction. To begin with, this comes from Tom and my experience. As you suggested, both of us were at the War College. I as the dean, he is the head of the Military History Institute, and of course participated in numerous staff rides involving students on the Gettysburg battlefield. We reflected on that and decided that this was a classroom, a crucible, as you suggested a moment ago, where leadership lessons stick out in bold relief due to the nature of a battle being a crisis, and therefore those things stick out much more clearly. And it could be a useful classroom then for any leader. And that's really one of the first important points also, is we firmly believe that leadership isn't in fact fungible. It doesn't matter whether you were leading in ancient Rome, or you were leading in the Revolutionary War, or you're leading a business, the Industrial Revolution, or business today, the United States Army. There are certain principles and concepts of leadership that are fundamental. Second of all, we believe that a common definition was important. So we reached back to another famous soldier, famous American, that being Dwight Eisenhower, who once said, leadership's about deciding what has to be done and getting others to want to do it. And I think very wisely pointing out to us, even if you'd been president twice, as he was, a 5-star general, actually president of a major university, you still need to spend some time getting buy-in, explaining to your team why this direction if I'm going to get max performance. And finally, and I know Eisenhower would agree, fundamental to all that, though, is ethics, integrity, and character. The real bedrock of leadership is that. It's really that which builds trust, and that trust, of course, ties the leader to his or her organization, whether it's a unit in battle or a corporate organization today. So that's how this all came about. And Tom, let me pass to you then to provide that leadership background, and then I'll come back with some anecdotes and principles.
All right, Jeff, thanks very much. I think the first thing we need to reaffirm is this book is a study of leadership using history as a backdrop. It is not a personal memoir. In other words, 158 years ago, no. And we've been asked the question, were you here at the Battle of Gettysburg? No, not here, not yet. And so it is a study of leadership on a battlefield. It's a study of people and organizations operating in a crisis mode. Any battle is a crisis. And so operating in an emergency situation, that's how you can best get to know how well trained, how well developed, how well led an organization is put them under stress. And Gettysburg certainly has 3 days of stress. And so working primarily over the last 10 years with a civilian audience, a non-military audience, if I may say, both for-profit and non-for-profit. A couple things we found about people is that some of them in the group, and the groups might be as small as a dozen or as large as 40 people in a group. People in the group, some of them will claim no interest in history, see no value in history, and so on. Another group, probably the same people relying on history, claim, what can I learn from a former military officer? And well, we believe that using history helps us to study leadership, individual, collective, organizational effectiveness. Because going back, at least I like to think that in my time, my 30 years in the Army, we strove to do 2 things every day. One was to train the organization for its wartime mission. In my case, training infantry squads and tank crews and for what we were going to have to do in a combat situation. But while we do that, the second thing we do is we train the leadership for the organization at all levels of the organization, train the leadership to step up to the next level. Because a military organization in a time of stress, in a time of crisis, in combat, in battle, you need a very sound leadership foundation in order for the organization to survive. So what we're seeking to build through this study of leadership, through our time on the battlefield studying leadership, we seek to build a survivable, sustainable, high-performing organization. And that applies to any military organization, but I should also say it applies to any non-military organization. Again, be it for-profit, not-for-profit. And so that same principle, I think that was what they would like to achieve. So Jeff, with that as a backdrop, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tom. Let me talk about sort of 4 quick anecdotes, which encompass 4 military officers and a politician, and use each one of those to talk about concepts and principles of leadership that, again, we believe are enduring, are fungible across the centuries. And to begin the battle chronologically, you'd have to talk about a Union general, Brigadier General by the name of John Buford, cavalry commander. He is screening the advance of the Union Army north to Gettysburg. He arrives in the town of Gettysburg on the afternoon of the 30th of June, quickly assesses the situation, which all good cavalry must do, and realizes first and foremost that there's a large Confederate force just to the west of town. He then has identified where the enemy is. And then he looks around to determine what's the key terrain. He determines the key terrain are Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and the Round Tops, just to the eastern side, southeastern side of Gettysburg. So he occupies a ridge line somewhat west of the city called McPherson's Ridge, realizing that he can perhaps then trade space for time while preserving control of that particular key terrain. He also gets some reports that perhaps there are more Confederate troops advancing down from the north as well as the force to his west. And then he quickly sends a series of messages to his boss, a 3-star general, General John Reynolds, commander of the left wing of the Union Army, summarized by the following. I have identified the enemy to the west of the town. Get the infantry up here first thing in the morning. Now, at that point in time, he is leading his boss. And we like to say smart people lead their boss consciously and not unconsciously. And smart leaders, smart bosses, want to be led and establish a climate whereby they can be led, particularly at difficult moments. John Reynolds could have said, hey, John Buford, come back here. Let's have a talk. Let's discuss this and figure out what we ought to do, have a committee meeting. But no, these 2 guys had worked together, and that trust I mentioned a little while ago had been established. So they can make decisions at the speed of trust. And Reynolds, receiving that message, quickly orders the Union Army to redouble its efforts to advance on Gettysburg. Second of all, of course, back to that definition by Ike, Buford really differentiates leadership and management. Management being those things we have to take care of every single day. Poorly managed organizations fail. So he's put his forces where he knows the Confederates are going to come. But he puts a screen to the north to anticipate for the future, thinking in time, which is really about leadership. So John Buford at this very onset leads his boss, and at the same time is thinking in time as a leader. And then finally, of course, he preserves that precious resource, which is time. Time being a resource all leaders must consider for their organization. The second officer I would talk about is on the second day, another Union officer. His name, Colonel Strong Vincent, an attorney from Erie, Pennsylvania. As the fighting is begun during the afternoon in the Peach Orchard, where the 3rd Corps of the Union Army is heavily being attacked by advancing Confederates, he is a part of an advancing Union division and is ordered to move his brigade in the wheat field to provide additional support for what is turning out to be a losing proposition. As he is advancing in that direction, however, he intercepts a courier from the General Warren, General Gouverneur Warren, who is the engineer for the Union Army. And in that message, the engineer says, we need troops on Little Round Top. But of course, Warren is a staff officer. He has no command authority whatsoever. Vincent, however, sized up the situation and executes a decision on the spot, which we think illustrates initiative. That is, making decision with no guidance. And he ignores his orders, which were to advance towards the Peach Orchard, and moves his forces up on Little Round Top, preserving that terrain in a very close fight, illustrated most famously by Joshua Chamberlain and the 20th Maine. You know, oftentimes I've talked to corporate groups, and frequently I'll say to them, let me see a show of hands. How many people in the room do not want to have initiative in their organization? Yeah. I very rarely get hands up. Then I ask them, how do you create a climate? Are you creating a climate that encourages initiative? And the room often goes silent. So think about Strong Vincent. This perhaps was illustrated in the more modern era by a famous American fighter pilot by the name of John Boyd. Boyd, of course, would be a famous fighter pilot during the Korean War, then trained fighter pilots in the war's aftermath, and create a concept he called the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act. And after he retires from the Air Force, he'll write about that concept as something organizations need to think about, observe the environment in which they're operating, orient on the key aspects that are going on, make decisions against those critical factors, and act. And he translates that for corporate leaders, government organizations, as well as the military. Well, in essence, that's truly what strong Vincent does. Observe what's going on, what's the critical point, little round top, make decisions, and act. So the OODA loop and initiative. The third anecdote I would talk about would be the evening of that second day, which I find to be one of the most critical and fascinating nights in American history. Two general officers, Robert E. Lee, George Gordon Meade, will have to make critical decisions on what their organizations are going to do the next day, and they pursue very different paths. Both of them are in houses, separate houses, of course, that they have occupied, both having been homes to widow ladies living in Gettysburg, and these houses are separated by about a mile distance. Robert E. Lee will meet with himself. He will have private counsel. He will not call his senior leaders in for a discussion. He is frustrated by the inability of his army to conduct what he thought would be coordinated attacks, which would bring them success. And over the night, he considers what he's going to do. And of course, early the next morning, he'll get on his horse, ride down Seminary Ridge, confront Peter Longstreet, and tell him to conduct a frontal assault on the center of the Union line, Pickett's charge. Pickett's charge. He will adjust his leadership style, an important thing to think about, in that prior to that, Lee had a very leadership style whereby he gave max empowerment to his subordinates because they'd always been successful. And this is displayed on day one in that famous order he gives to General Ewell to take that hill, meaning Cemetery Hill, if you deem it practicable to do so, which Ewell does not think it is. But as time goes on and Lee becomes more and more frustrated, he adjusts his style from being one of broad guidance to being one that's very direct. And he is very direct with Peter Longstreet, who does not think this is going to work, that you'll make this attack. Now contrast that a mile away. What's going on that evening? George Gordon Meade, now been in command of the Union Army entire 4 days. Robert E. Lee, 16 months, an icon in the Confederacy, a very different position. George Gordon Meade, 4 days, leading his peer group in many ways. Several of the Union generals that he commands actually outranked him by their date of rank, even though obviously he was the commander. He calls all his senior members in, his corps commanders. They have a meeting. What are we going to do tomorrow? What are we going to do tomorrow? Eventually, his chief of staff gets frustrated and calls for a vote. Voting in reverse order of rank, the most junior man voting first, so he's not intimidated by leaders. They decide they will stay and defend at Gettysburg. They will not attack. They will not retreat. They will defend the ground on which they are. Now, Tom and I have talked about this a lot. We're pretty convinced that's what Meade was going to do anyway. But back to Dwight Eisenhower, he felt that need, particularly as a guy who only been in command 4 days, to get that consensus from my team for max performance. And then the final person I talk about, some may find curious, will actually be a politician. On the 19th of November, 1863, of course, Abraham Lincoln will arrive the evening before, and the next day he will deliver the Gettysburg Address. I often pause and talk to people about that and say, you know, if you were Lincoln, would you have come to Gettysburg? And we all know he did, but let's think about it from his perspective. Why would you go? Why would you go? You receive your invitation about 10 days prior to the event, not exactly timely. The keynote speaker is actually a political opponent who had run for the vice presidency on the Union Party ticket in 1860 against you, a guy named Edward Everett. Everett got his invitation in September, and you get yours about 10 days in advance to make a few appropriate remarks. You are not the keynote speaker. Number two, the war's still going on, and presidents don't travel that much in the 19th century. And number three, if that's not enough, your wife is adamantly opposed to you going to Gettysburg. Why? Well, because their only surviving son, who is still at home, is very ill. The Lincolns would lose a son, Willie, in February of 1862 due to a fever. And his son, Tad, is very ill. Mrs. Lincoln thinks Tad is going to die, and she begs Lincoln, don't go to Gettysburg, stay here because the child is ill. Despite all that, Lincoln will go to Gettysburg. Why? Well, I think for two reasons. Reason number one is it's a matter of timing. I said before, time is important for leaders, but timing. When do you make a key decision? When is the right moment? And I think Lincoln has determined, if I'm going to describe a new vision for the nation, this is the moment to do that. Edward Everett will speak for 2 hours. I've read the speech. It's interesting, hardly memorable. And then Lincoln will advance the podium and speak for 2.5 minutes. That's about how long the Gettysburg Address needs to be said, and it's 272 words. What's interesting about that is he's describing a new vision, I would argue, for the organization, in this case, the United States. He organizes that particular vision in a way that any leader can use when talking to his or her organization, particularly about change. It's divided in 3 parts. Most of us old soldiers probably have used this. Where have we been? Where are we right now? Where are we going? In the case of Lincoln, where have we been? 77 years ago, you do the math, takes you back to 1776, signing of the Declaration of Independence, which Lincoln thought was the bedrock of our democracy. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Where are we right now? We have been met on the battlefield of a great war. It is right and proper we should be here. Where are we going? We're going to a new birth of freedom. Up until that point, if you were going to ask, sort of organizationally, what is the vision? What's the purpose of this war? In the North, it's to preserve the Union. And that's what Lincoln had talked about in his first inaugural. And even though the Emancipation Proclamation frees slaves, it only does so in the states under rebellion. It does not end slavery in the United States. That doesn't come until you get the 13th Amendment. So where are we going? We're going to a new birth of freedom. So I would argue, and do so in the book, that when those 15,000, and that's what we roughly believe the population was in attendance, walk into the cemetery that morning, the vision for the nation is to preserve the Union. When they walk out of the cemetery, the vision now has been expanded. It's to preserve the Union, but that now is inextricably linked with the ending of slavery, that new birth of freedom. So again, time and timing for a leader, and using that where we've been, where we are, and where are we going as a format for any leader to talk about change and vision for his or her organization.
Yeah, great.
Turn it over to you.
Yeah, Tom wanted to follow up a little bit.
I wish to say that given the 4 examples that Jeff just narrated to us, we use that technique, that kind of technique, to humanize the story, to humanize the delivery on the leadership lesson. Remember, I spoke earlier of a small percentage of each group is doubtful of history value, is doubtful of military leaders being appropriate to them. Well, telling the story, illustrating the leadership principles in the context of humanizing the people, the Buford and so on, that swings them over. And so they can identify with themselves. As we go through the book, we go through the process, we put the reader, we put the groups into what we call leadership challenges. We tell them the background, the historical background, and then we say, all right, you are General John Buford, what are you going to do? So you have to think about it. Then we come back and we tell you what Buford did. So that's how the book's pretty well organized, and we think there's a lot of value in the principles.
Yeah, you know, I'd add to that. One thing we've learned, not surprisingly, is we believe that you could talk about leadership development in a very dry format. We could talk about concepts and principles. We could use PowerPoint, and that would not sink in too much. But what we found in our work is if you're working with a group, you put them in a role, and then you tie the concept, as we do in the book, or the principle, to a story. This has what I call intellectual stickiness.
Yeah.
And we find that this then sticks with persons. A. B, if they're all from one organization, they're from a corporation, we work a lot of leadership teams from big urban school districts. They're the board of a big nonprofit organization, and we've done all those. They now have a common vocabulary and a common story, and they'll hearken back to that principle and say, oh, that's just like when we were at Gettysburg and we were talking about vision and we're standing there in the cemetery. So the tie between the concept and the story gives it that intellectual stickiness that I think makes it very more powerful.
Before we get into questions, I have a couple, but for those that haven't read the book, in addition to the stories about the commanders and what occurred on the battlefield, our authors have included vignettes from corporate experiences. Right. Could you tell us about a couple that you put in the book?
Oh my goodness. Well, certainly one.
Enron.
Yeah, Enron is a classic example of an organization, and that's the whole idea of leading the boss being a classic one, because Enron illustrates the concept of ethics and character and integrity being a bedrock of history. Unfortunately, we see that. And at the time, I believe it was the 7th largest corporation in the United States. Second of all, of course, it has to do with all the leading the boss and being unconnected. And I often say, if bosses aren't careful by their actions, they can become totally disconnected. They can end up in a bubble in which only good information arrives. And I'm sure all of us, perhaps at some point in our career, have experienced that, where we know if the boss shoots the messenger, guess what? Bad news is not going to come his or her way.
Right.
And that certainly happens to Ken Lay. In the aftermath of that disaster, there was clear evidence that one of his vice presidents is sending him emails. And in those emails, she is saying, we are going to collapse in a wave of accounting scandals. He will die before he is actually before trial. So it's unclear if those messages ever got to him, or if he, again, had gotten himself into that kind of bubble where only good information is coming my way.
Yeah, that's a fascinating concept, leading the boss. Let me before we get a couple of questions here, Civil War battlefield, especially Gettysburg, tens of thousands of troops spread out over miles and miles. Commanders in that period had no choice but to delegate authority, and some did it better than others. But as you look at today's interconnected world, where we have instant contact with subordinates, how should we look at delegation of authority?
Let me take a crack at that,
Yeah.
Tom, and I'll give it to you. Two ways. Oftentimes when we're on the battlefield, we'll go up to Oak Hill. One of the first things I do, which is always amusing, is I take out my cell phone and I say, how many of the people in the group don't have a cell phone? People usually laugh. We had one guy who didn't have a cell phone. He was very proud of the fact he didn't have a cell phone. And the point I try to make with him is, Robert E. Lee and George Gordon Meade were at different places technologically in terms of, you could call it overall command and control. Meade, of course, the telegraph will be put into Gettysburg very quickly. It exists. And throughout the battle, he's getting these red hot messages all the time. From Washington, we know Abraham Lincoln will spend most of his time in the telegraph office, along with General Halleck. And of course, they're trying to help Meade. They're trying to help him, right? Robert E. Lee, on the other side, when he crosses the Potomac River, his boss, Jefferson Davis, the only way he can help him or guide him is to put a guy on horseback, send him up there, and maybe 4 or 5 days later, he might find him.
Yeah.
Well, what's my point? Well, my point is we want our organizations to have initiative, but if we're not careful, our interconnectedness can rob us of that initiative, because we're standing there, we know what we need to do for our organization, our subcomponent of this larger organization. We've been well trained, we're well prepared, but I can call my boss, I can text him or her, I can email him. Maybe I should just do that, And they do that, and then what do? Well, we wait to hear from them.
Yeah.
We wait to hear, and time, that most precious resource that leaders have, goes on the wayside. We were with a large corporate group one time that put in large oil and natural gas pipelines all across the United States. And you watch people's body language. And this one guy started dropping his head and he's shaking his head like that. And I thought maybe we'd lost him. I said, what do you think? And he goes, that is so true. He said, I put these teams out in far points of remote Texas and Canada to put in oil and natural gas pipelines. I train them. They're ready to go. They got all the assets they need. Something goes wrong, and they will call me, text me, email me. And then the whole crew just sits there and waits until they finally track me down. So that is part and parcel of it. The other part is, of course, Lee has a real difficulty in the two of his principal commanders, Richard Ewell and Ambrose Powell Hill, have been elevated from being a divisional commander to being corps commanders just shortly prior to this battle. But as you were saying, sir, they've come from an environment as a division commander, which, due to the frontages in the American Civil War, still allowed you to potentially see what's going on and direct what's going on for your organization. Now, when you move to corps, however, you are an indirect leader. You have to anticipate, think in time, lead through others. And this is an enormous exponential leap, which they have great difficulty with. And frankly, I would argue their failure to do so probably contributes to the Southern defeat. So leaders have got to adjust their style. As I mentor and coach subordinates, when I move them to a new position, I may need to be a bit more direct with them until they get comfortable, they feel they're in the swing of things. And then I need to understand, I need to back off, or I will abrogate that opportunity for initiative.
Yeah. Tom, anything to add?
No,
to
I
that,
think
or-
we've talked through that one.
Okay, okay. Let me hit one more here, and it's kind of a corollary to delegation of authority, and that's micromanagement. You have an example in the book where John Reynolds
Right.
gets down as a corps commander down to a very tactical level, and there's a lot of discussion in the book about where should a leader be? Where can I, as a leader, be the most effective right now? Tell us about that particular.
Well,
Well,
you
you
start off-
mentioned, sir, you mentioned General Reynolds and being shot, and he commands the left wing of the Federal Army as they move from Maryland up into Pennsylvania, looking for the Confederates, and they find them at Gettysburg. So he's got roughly 28,000 infantry and artillerymen under his command. And he arrives at Gettysburg and he takes immediate action. Buford's men have held off the Confederate advance the morning of July 1st. And Reynolds comes up behind him with the infantry and the additional artillery. And Reynolds was personally placing units in line. The leading brigade goes on the far side, the north side of the Chambersburg Pike. And then the Iron Brigade, the famous Iron Brigade, comes in. And so Reynolds is behind the 2nd Wisconsin Regiment and encouraging them into an area called Herbst Woods. And they can see through the woods, they can see the Confederates advancing toward them. And both sides can see each other. And Reynolds is encouraging the men of the 2nd Wisconsin, forward, men, forward, for God's sakes, drive those fellows from the trees. And he turns his head to give orders to encourage the next regiment coming into line. He takes a bullet under his right ear and he slides off the left side of his horse. He's dead on the ground. So what we do in the book, we challenge the reader. We lay out that scenario and say, all right, was John Reynolds at the right place at the right time, the wrong place at the wrong time, or the wrong place at the right time, or right time at the wrong place? But we challenge the reader to think through the process. There's no book answer to it. We challenge the reader to think about their leadership style and where is the most effective place for them to be in any given situation, particularly in a situation that is in a crisis mode. And so Reynolds is taken out. 28,000 he's in charge of, but he's with 302.
Yeah,
And you can argue it both ways. I mean, certainly you can argue on the one hand that he is, as Tom just said, he's a command of 20,000+ troops, but he's managing about 360 when, unfortunately, he is killed. But you could argue on the reverse of that. You could argue he had determined for his organization, this is the crucial moment for our organization. This is an existential moment at this spot. If we fail here, the whole enterprise collapses. And you can argue it either way. The exercise is to get people to think about that, and because too oftentimes, back to technology, what I fear is people say to themselves, well, now, in the 21st century, goodness, I can lock myself in my office. I got a fax machine. I got my iPad. I got my computer. I got my cell phone. I can run the living hell out of this organization from right here. No. Socrates, way back in the day, was correct. He said man, and he meant men and women, are social animals. Men and women are social animals, and they interact in that fashion. So even today, despite all that technology, the leader has to think through, particularly when his or her organization experiences a crisis, where do I need to be physically? Where do I need to be seen physically? And that's particularly important about also in terms of how I manage that organization during a crisis. I find it fascinating. I look a lot at some of the data coming out on how we talk about different generations, baby boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, Gen Z. We do this exercise, almost invariably, we'll find the group will split along generational lines. What do I mean by that? There's nothing that angers millennials and Gen Z more than to be micromanaged. It really bugs them to death, even though they probably need a little coaching and guidance at times. And this is frankly a very, very timely topic because every organization, for every person on this call and on this program, is now involved to some degree in a personal and or organizational transition from being totally decentralized to back being together. How leaders handle that transition over the next 6 months, thinking that through, where should I be and where should we be and what are our new cultural protocols, is probably the most crucial decision any organization is going to make in the next year.
We're actually going through that ourselves
Exactly.
right now
That's right.
as we start coming back to the office. Hey, there's a good question here from one of our participants who got a lot of votes, and that is, what's the difference between a gamble and a calculated risk? And how would you characterize Pickett's charge under those two
Well,
terms?
Tom, let me take the first half of that, and you can then characterize the charge. How's that?
All right, we can
Well,
do that.
If we were doing this in Las Vegas instead of doing this in Arlington, Virginia,
Yeah.
then the difference is fairly clear. If you walk down to the tables and you start throwing the ivories down the table, that's a gamble, okay? And the good Lord is going to associate how well we do. Maybe a little skill, but primarily a gamble. A risk, obviously, is a calculation, and I'll let Tom talk about it from the historical standpoint, in which a leader sits down and says, what is the potential gain, and then how much am I willing to risk? And obviously, that calculation is critical. Why? Well, we're not going to risk, enormous things for something that's trivial.
Yeah.
And I think in Robert E. Lee's case, what's going on here more broadly is a fundamental belief that he has come north with his army in the summer of 1863 to win the war.
Yeah.
We're not here to win a battle. No. We're here to win the war, because he understood that strategically the South could just not endure. We just cannot maintain this. We don't have the resources, the manpower. The North has all that on their side. We got to get this over with. So that's why this becomes, for him, a strategic risk. But Tom, I'll let you talk about it from the standpoint of Pickett.
Well, for the event misnamed in history as Pickett's charge, since there were 6,500 other men besides Pickett's division of 6,000 making Longstreet's attack of the third day at Gettysburg. Sorry, but I get hung up on historical correctness. So Lee orders that attack because, based on his experience, that I call it a calculated risk. Let's do the calculation. He's been in command 13 months of the Army of Northern Virginia, and in that time, his boys, they won every battle. You can call Antietam perhaps a draw, but they won every battle he's asked them to win. And in every battle that they've won, the Yankee Army has retreated after 1 or 2 days of fighting. Based on his experience, his calculation of calculated risk is all they need is one more little push. They've been strong on the flanks. We couldn't get around down at Big Round Top, Little Round Top, Devil's Den. We couldn't get around there with Longstreet's guys. Ewell couldn't break over there at Culp's Hill. So they were strong there. So we're going to attack the weak center. The center, that's another calculation. Their center must be weak. So that's the calculated risk he's going to make there. And he's going to order the attack. So often people come there with us. Field Marshal Montgomery asked General Eisenhower, who gave the Field Marshal a tour of the battlefield, what was Lee thinking when he ordered the attack? And a lot of people ask us the same question. Well, it was a calculated risk, and I think I've pretty well outlined that the case there.
Okay, we'll leave that one to the history books. But let me get. We're getting down a little bit of time here, but in the book you talk about organizational change and culture, and as we look at the timing of the battle, the armies involved, the leaders involved, we're facing an army that was certainly the leaders, many West Point graduates, trained in 18th century Napoleonic warfare, right, even as technology is right, advancing. This is common throughout history and common in business too. So could you talk about that, sure, that yin and yang of culture and technology? Yeah.
Probably the place that this is encapsulated is certainly around the firearms we're using and the difference between a 1865 musket and an early 19th century musket that you might see in the Napoleonic era that you mentioned, or perhaps the War of 1812. Those earlier weapons fired a musket ball. It was about a 64, 65 caliber slug. The bore of the weapon was smooth, therefore it had a range of maybe as many as 400 meters, but it was relatively inaccurate. So as a consequence, tactics become, we're firing an inaccurate weapon with a slow rate of fire. We're going to bring everybody close together to get that mass fire and hopefully hit something we throw a lot of bullets at that way. By 1863, of course, we now have the mini ball. It's conical shaped, looks more like a bullet as we know it. It has grooves, there'll be wax in those grooves, and the inside of the bore now is grooved. is rifled, so as the round goes down, it spins, which stabilizes it, makes it a lot more accurate. But we're still using the same tactics. So we now have a large soft lead bullet, which is accurate, but we're still doing this close packed formation and still getting within 50 to 100 meters before we engage. What does that mean? Higher and higher casualty rates, higher and higher casualty rates. It's very interesting because it is a civil war that both sides follow procedures which are common. Both of them use the standard Army tactical manual for formations that was written during the War of 1812, which called for those tight formations. Well, that had not been revised by 1863. And again, I'm confident everybody on the call here has been part of an organization at some time, or they joined an organization. They saw the organization doing something they didn't think was terribly smart, and they said, why do we do it that way? And the response always is, well, we've always done it that way. We've done it that way since the War of 1812. Why would we change now? And leaders have to be attuned to what are those small changes in technology. Nanotechnology being an example today, where we now can create satellites that are the size of a baseball that do the same thing that a satellite we launched 10, 15 years ago, the size of a bus, can do. Well, that changes the whole calculation in terms of using outer space if you can make this out of the size of a baseball. So leaders have got to understand technology, small changes in technology, and how that affects either my organization or the environment in which I'm operating.
We're getting down to time here. I will get. I'll ask you guys to wrap up here in a minute about what you want readers to get out of the book as they start reading it or rereading it. But no discussion of the Battle of Gettysburg is complete without some comments about Joshua Chamberlain, the great commander of the 20th Maine, Little Round Top. You take a little different approach about discussing this particular leader in the book. We know what he did on the day of the battle, but could you talk about what he was doing prior to the battle with other men from Maine and this notion of emotional intelligence?
Tom, why don't you tell them the background of that, and then I'll take the emotional intelligence piece.
All right. Well, Chamberlain, college professor, not a professional soldier. In fact, only a third of the 582 general officers in the Federal Army were professional soldiers.
Right.
He's a college professor, comes into the Army in 1862. The war's gone on already for a year before he decides to come in. He's going to end up as first lieutenant colonel and then colonel of the 20th Regiment from the state of Maine. In the prelude to the Gettysburg battle, as they are marching to catch up with the Confederate Army in Pennsylvania, a provost marshal brings some men from the 2nd Maine Regiment who have, we can't quite call it mutiny, but they are refusing, I guess you could, if they're refusing to obey orders and so on. These men had signed 3-year enlistments in the 2nd Maine. The rest of the 2nd Maine, most of the men in the 2nd Maine had signed 2-year enlistments. They're going home. Their enlistments have expired. These 3-year men have another year to serve. They don't agree with the Army's assessment of that. And so they go into a shutdown mode, and they're taken by the provost marshal to the 20th Maine. That's the closest Maine unit. And basically the young provost marshal tells Chamberlain, here, these guys are from Maine, they're now your problem.
And he's also told that, if you want to shoot them, you can go ahead and do that. It doesn't matter to me. Nobody will really care if you do that. Chamberlain's regiment has been through an awful lot of fighting, a lot of disease, and as a consequence, they are down in strength probably by 2/3, or well below 1,000 men that a regiment would be authorized, down around 300. So he's got these 40 guys. He convinces them, talks to them. We know that it's dramatized in the movie, of course. And all of them, but 1 or 2 actually fight for the 20th Maine. Well, if you know the battle at Little Round Top and the 20th Maine, you know this is a very close run affair. They sustain numerous attacks by the Confederates. The last attack, they probably break up by using a very famous bayonet charge. And I would argue, just looking at that fighting, if he doesn't convince those 40 guys to now join his unit,
right.
he fails. because I would have to take some of my assets to guard them, and they were a net loss as opposed to a net gain. So his ability to convince them to join my unit for this critical moment is the difference between failure and success. How does he do that? Well, he didn't know anything about this. This is more of a 20th century concept, and that being emotional intelligence, most largely associated with a Dr. Daniel Goleman from Yale University. In his work on this as a sociologist, what Goleman says is leaders have to think about the following. First of all, how they maintain their own emotional control in difficult moments. And I'm sure, again, many of us have been involved with leaders who lost their temper at a tough moment. I haven't found any examples where that made things better, okay? It's a difficult moment Chamberlain has, and he maintains self-control in dealing with this problem with the soldiers, and certainly during the fighting. Secondly, the leader's ability to be self-aware of himself or herself. Next, to be have a certain amount of empathy. That doesn't mean you're easy on the people that work for you, but you can kind of understand where they're coming from. I can understand your problem. I can try to have a certain degree of empathy. And last but not least, your willingness to listen, and listen really clearly into what they have to say. The good news is, according to Goleman's analysis, that leaders can develop emotional intelligence by thinking about it, studying about it. Your IQ, your latent intelligence, may cap at a certain point in your life just by your maturity, but your emotional intelligence can continue to grow as you think and work on this. And in many colleges and universities today, particularly in fields like business administration or MBA programs, they find it may be the most successful thing, or one of the most reasons why a certain student is successful. So his ability to do that, these guys come on board, he demonstrates that emotional intelligence, I would argue, and the consequence is success. And failure at that moment would have meant the Confederates sweep over Little Round Top, outflank the Union Army. Gettysburg is a 2-day battle and a Confederate victory, and then you can take history in whatever direction you would like.
Yeah, you know, the Army, is, as you gentlemen know, is going through a lot of talent management change, including the way we assess battalion level commanders. And the term emotional intelligence and that concept is being inculcated into our leaders. So very timely. We are down to time here, so I'm going to let Jeff and Tom wrap it up for us and tell us, for those that haven't read the book, what should they get out of the book?
Tom, go ahead.
Well, we would hope that you could read the book and recognize certain leadership principles which ought to be followed. Because remember, in the final analysis, what we're talking about here is people leading people. And we highlight a number of concepts, a number of principles, which these leaders demonstrated through use of history. We have interpreted those for you in the historical context and put them out there as examples, also crosswalking into the modern world, taking that same principle, put it into a non-military setting, a non-military organization, and talking a little bit about it. So identifying principles that you can use as you read the book, then do a self-assessment and say, I think maybe this is something I need to consider implementing. So that's my expectation. That's my hope.
I go back to where I started, and that is this definition by Eisenhower I find intriguing. Learn that leaders are all about deciding what has to be done and getting others to want to do it. This suggests me as well. I oftentimes am asked, do you do leaders training? I said, no, I don't do leader training. I do leader development. I can train you on how to head space and time a 50 caliber machine gun, or how to change the oil in your car. But this is about development. And I think it also suggests to any leader, whatever walk of life, that again, these concepts and principles are fungible. And second of all, it's a journey and not a destination. That we are all on that journey throughout our lives, and therefore it becomes one of those things that we have to be a lifelong learner. And then finally, of course, that leaders of organizations need to understand that every single day, I think Tom mentioned this earlier on, I'll reiterate, every single day, every organization does two things. It executes whatever its mission is, making widgets, leading the AUSA, leading the United States Army. And the second thing it does is it develops the next generation of leaders to move that organization even into a better place.
Yeah, and I think for our audience here, this book applies at whatever level of the organization you happen to be in. There's something in here for lower level, entry level leaders, strategic leaders. There's something here for everyone. And the last thing, I want to thank both of you for a little treat that you put at the end of the book. I often wonder whatever happened to these people after the war.
Right.
And both Tom and Jeff have singled out 20 leaders that are described in the book and their actions in the book and what happened to them after the war. Probably one of the more fascinating parts of the book. So thank you, gentlemen, for
Thank
this.
you.
This is really good. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, you've got to read this book. It really, whatever level of leadership you're at or want to be a better leader, take a look at Battle Tested. It is really worth your time. Before we close, though, I have a couple of announcements I want everybody to know about. Our next Thought Leaders webinar is on 8 July. We'll have a very distinguished panel of Chief Warrant Officer Fives joining us literally the day before the 103rd anniversary of the Warrant Officer Corps to talk about the role warrant officers play in today's Army. That's on 8 July. Then on the 21st of July, we'll have another Thought Leaders webinar, and that will be on holistic health. That will be led by our Executive Vice President here at AUSA, General Bob Brown, Lieutenant General Walt Pyatt, the Director of the Army Staff, Lieutenant General Scott Dingle, the Army Surgeon General, Lieutenant General retired Patricia Horoho, the former Surgeon General of the Army, and Colonel Deidre Tahan. That's on the 21st. On the 22nd of July, we'll have an AUSA noon report that will highlight the role of women in technology in the Army, featuring Major General Maria Barrett, the NETCOM commander, and Ms. Nancy Creedler. And that'll be sponsored by Ernst & Young, and we appreciate their sponsorship. Don't forget, we're back in business this year in October. AUSA's annual meeting will be held at the DC Convention Center 11 to 13 October. We expect it to be, as you all remember it, the biggest event in town during that week, 11 to 13 October. All of these events and much more can be found on the AUSA website at ausa.org. Just go to the website. Everything is there. You can register for all these events, and we hope you'll do that. And finally, thank you for your membership. I know both our guests here are proud members of AUSA, and if you're a member, thank you. If you're not a member, go to ausa.org and join us. We can't do these events without your assistance. So again, Jeff, Tom, thank you very much. Great lessons learned in the book, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, sir, for the opportunity.
Absolutely. And everybody else, have a great Army Day.